Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson. It's going to be the fourth in a series on landscape sketching, and it'll be our final lesson for this series. So if you look back through previous videos, you'll see the progression up to this stage. Because it's been sketching, I've been using a different sketch each week rather than building up the same drawing like I will with some of the more sustained sketches. If you guys want to keep up to date with these lessons or any OCAD lessons, just subscribe. Then you'll get notifications when everything's posted or if we've got any live classes. But yeah, to get started, last week we were looking at establishing general masses of tone in our sketch. So in this case we've got a sort of foreground plane. There's two masses of kind of hillsides of trees. There's a body of water here which is about the same value as the sky, and then progressively lighter sets of hills going back in the distance. And if I zoom in, you can kind of see it's pretty loosely sketched in. It's not refined in any way. We're just looking at generally establishing a value arrangement. And this followed on from blocking in the initial shapes. So if you were to look at the shapes, we look at this body of water, this kind of spit of land, another body of water, three sets of hills, forest on this right hand side, and then this little lone tree. So those are our major elements. When we actually finish a drawing, one of the main things we want to think about is where do we want the viewer to look. Sorry, I've got a bit of a cough today. Where do we want the viewer to look? And how do we want their eyes to travel through the image? Now, we kind of touched on composition in I think it was the first lesson of this series when we looked at balancing your composition. Today I'm going to be introducing another aspect of composition, which is sort of the way the eye flows through the image. So that's kind of the main thing about composition, really. Generally, the eye will be drawn to a point of highest contrast in the image, and it will also be drawn to places that are more detailed. So something that's always useful to do in sketches is to build detail up in one particular area and leave everything else fairly unrefined. If you do this, it gives the impression that you've intended for a particular part to be detailed and you've intended for some things to be left unfinished. If everything is unfinished as it is in this state, it just looks a bit loose, a bit too loose and sketchy. If I was to bring in to focus, say, this body of water and this little tree, even if everything else wasn't finished at all, the drawing would feel a lot more sophisticated, and it's only a tiny bit more work. In a lot of ways, it's preferable to rendering everything. If you render everything, it becomes a bit like a photograph, if you were to render it minutely. And we want something that looks like a drawing. So what I'd recommend doing is rendering specific parts of the drawing to help your composition or what you want to get out of your composition. The other thing that happens when the viewer's eye travels is, so let's say they're attracted to this point of highest contrast. So just here, there's this very dark tree in the foreground, and then there's going to be this kind of little strip of white water behind. That is likely where the viewer's eye will be attracted in this image. It's also quite central. Typically, you look at the center of the image. If one was to look there, they're not in yet, but there are these kind of lines traveling through the grass that pull the eye to the left. There's also a kind of general sense of this water pulling the eye to the left. This is a fairly kind of, should we say, it's more feeling based rather than there's definitely a line there. But the eye will move one way or the other. It'll go up, it'll go down, it'll go left, it'll go right. And it'll travel kind of the path of least resistance. So if there's lots of lines leading out in a linear fashion from a particular point where you start looking, that's where your eye will tend to travel. This side has another kind of clump of bushes, which are sort of a visual block for the eye, so they don't travel as easily right. So in this instance, I would say the eye would travel left. Then we've got this hillside, which has a lot of vertical trees running up it, so it would travel up. And then hopefully we want to try to get the eyes to hit this kind of blank space of the sky, and then drop back down along this top of these kind of far mountains or hillsides, back down to that center point. We sort of miss out this right hand section a bit, but hopefully the eye travels there as well afterwards. But basically we're trying to keep the eye contained in the image for as long as possible. If the eye just gets shot straight outside the image, it's not as engaging. And that's where composition is really important. So if you look at very complex compositions from painters like Rubens with sort of 30 figures and swirling forms all going around in different directions, you'll see, and if you kind of start to break them down, you'll see that those forms swirl because they're trying to keep your eye on the image. They're trying to make your eye see everything in the image before it leaves. And that's your kind of ultimate goal with a composition. And the same applies for abstract composition as well. An abstract composition, the idea of composition is purely abstract. It's got nothing to do with whether you're looking at a tree or a body of water or a little bit of forest. It's about what's this shape, what contrast is it, how kind of complex is it, what lines lead away from it. So that could just be a random shape and a bunch of random lines, and it could make no sense in a representational sense. And it would still have the same progression. Your eye would progress through the image in the same way. So yeah, that covers kind of the point of focus, the way that your eyes travel, which will be how we first start building up our detail. Just going to check my notes here. The second aspect of detail are transitions. So the way that this looks at the moment, it's all quite flat. All the tones are roughly similar. Whereas in nature, everything's always got a transition. There's a gradient going from light to dark. So it's not actually the case here because the sky is very overcast and bright. But if the sky was blue, you'd have a transition from a darker part of the sky to a lighter part of the sky. Trees will typically have a transition going from darker to lighter. Very often the bottom might be slightly lighter than the top. Groups of masses of trees might be darker at the bottom and then they get lighter as they get towards the sky. Reflections in water will have a subtle gradient. We might get a little bit of that today. The ground plane will maybe tend to get lighter as it gets towards you, which isn't actually always the case in nature, but it works quite well in the context of the drawing, and so on. So that's an important aspect of what we'll be doing in order to make it look sophisticated. You can keep everything quite simple in terms of shapes, but if you add those transitions, those subtle transitions, it just adds a little bit of sophistication to the image. Ooh, got a bit blown out there. And finally, the last thing we'll look at is texture. So it's not going to be a huge amount of varied texture. There's going to be a subtle difference between this kind of general sense of texture in the trees compared to the grass, grass is kind of soft, a bit fluffy in this sketch. The trees are going to have, or the kind of masses of trees are going to have little sections maybe where you get a suggestion of a trunk or something like that, breaking up the raggedness of the leaves. This little tree here is going to be a little bit more kind of dotty and spotty. And then the water is going to be quite smooth. The sky's just going to be white in this particular instance. So we can get started. So the first thing I'm going to do before going specifically into large amounts of detail, or going into texture, I suppose, in very specific sections, I'm going to just refine my edges because this has all been sketched in loosely. So both these tree lines have slightly more ragged edges. The distant tree lines I might leave for now because they're going to remain a bit less sophisticated or a bit less complete. And then I'm going to look quite closely at the shape of this body of water because that's pretty much, that and this little tree are our points of focus in the image. So we can get started doing that now. It's important at this stage to keep your pencil quite sharp. So I've got a little sanding block, but you can sharpen with a regular sharpener if you like. So I've also got an eraser today, so the last few weeks I haven't actually been using an eraser, but this will help us as we try to shape everything. So I might begin with this tree line. So might just neaten out some of these spots of light. This is where I missed when I was shading in initially. That's pretty good. And then I'm just going to kind of travel down the edge of this hillside. And just focus on the portion of the drawing or portion of the tree that reaches out into that space of the sky. So there's a kind of, I guess the most interesting point is this little section. Zoom in just so you guys can see in detail. There's this one quite large tree that seems to kind of jut in front of and kind of on top of the other ones. So that tree kind of sits on top of some slightly lighter tops of kind of more rounded trees. They kind of look almost more... These trees jutting up look a bit like conifers, like pines or something like that. Whereas these trees below look a little bit more like maybe they're deciduous, a bit more rounded, kind of broad-leafed. So there's a kind of general tendency for the tree to get, it's sort of darker near the bottom here, and then it gets lighter as it reaches up towards the sky. So these deciduous looking trees are then overlapped by another group just right down the front of the clump. So it's kind of these layers overlapping each other we're starting to find. And this is what we're doing when we're looking for detail. So within the context of the values that we established initially, we're looking for specifics. And that's all finding detail really is. And it's enjoyable. It's not so hard to do. If you've established everything pretty well at the beginning of your drawing, you can do this quite comfortably. You won't find you have to correct too much. You'll see I haven't used an eraser a great deal yet. Then got little kind of gaps in the trees that run up from the ground plane. Then as they go further back in the distance, just getting a bit lighter, so getting a kind of general transition across the group of trees. There's another similar kind of tree here that juts up a little bit. It's a little bit of character, so I'll put that in just because if you can find in things with kind of nice character that are in your kind of the section of the drawing that you want to render more clearly, definitely work with them. I wouldn't do something like that for these background hills, but this this clump of trees is roughly in line. This kind of area is where I'm rendering at the moment. But yeah, that's probably sufficient level of detail. The only thing I might go in and do is just using this eraser. Bit crumbly, this one. Might just try to find some little sections of trunk that are visible, because there are bits where you can see the trunk a little bit more, and that's an aspect of texture. Yeah, kind of basically it just gives a really subtle suggestion that the trunks are there. I can kind of reinforce them slightly with a little bit of darkening. But yeah, it's not too bad. I might jump over to kind of keep in level. We've now got our right hand group of trees, which is a little bit simpler shape wise. It kind of juts out over the water slightly, cuts back in, travels up, and then we've got kind of again a sort of ragged edge, different shapes of trees. One of the main things you're looking for when you're looking for detail is irregularity. So rather than trying to make every tree the same along the tree line, look for lots of differences. It's those differences that make things look natural. And the same is true for any subject that you're working with. But particularly for natural forms, natural landscapes. Trees have a lot of character, a lot of kind of organized disorder, so their branches will grow in a kind of irregular way, or they'll grow next to one another in a way that has its own sort of logic. And that's what's really beautiful about trees when you're working from them. So you want to look for that rhythm. So there's this rhythm that kind of flows through the trees. Don't get repetitive, don't just start doing the same shapes over and over again, because it'll make your drawing look more static. So we've just got a kind of basic tree line. I might go in and do some little bits here, similar. Sections where some trees jut above and they're a little bit more scraggly. And then nearer the bottom they're a bit darker and they kind of overlap each other again. Probably sufficient for the amount of detail we need out of that. At the same time, I might just go in and just correct this shape of this body of water as it's at about the same level. I don't want to spend a lot of time at all on this lighter section of hillside, because we want it to remain in the background, and keeping it in the background, part of that is or managing to keep it successfully in the background is keeping it less detailed. Also a bit lighter, because obviously as it travels back it's getting lighter due to the kind of atmosphere that's going on. And then these other hillsides are even lighter again. So something like that's not too bad. So I've kind of found myself working on this whole body of water in the end, kind of continuing on from that point, but it makes sense to do it at this stage while I'm defining everything else. That's the water roughly sketching. I might just darken the bottom of these trees just to emphasize where that water is in the background. That works pretty well. Just going to sharpen my pencil again. Then we can go in and find this tree. As I say, I'm going to make it the darkest part of my drawing, just so this contrast here becomes eye-catching. So I'm going to make it detailed and dark. That way people's eyes will be drawn to it. Shadow underneath it just to set it in place, and that's pretty much it. That tree doesn't need loads of detail. The rest of the sketches are going to be super detailed. Zoom back out slightly. So that pretty much sorts us out for our midground and our background. We've got this point of focus. We can start looking at this kind of clump of shrub that's just to the right. It's got this a sort of darker undercut section, and then lighter foliage sitting on top. If you differ your kind of direction of your pencil strokes, that partly creates that sense of texture. So if everything's going up this way for the trees mostly, but then suddenly you've got some kind of different skirting lines down below in this shrub, it just makes the shrub feel a little bit different. Probably roughly about that amount of detail is sufficient for the scrub. To find the top shape, you kind of work back down from the tree line behind, and you can define a more specific shape for the top of it. Then maybe kind of divide it into little clumps. Something like that would be sufficient. It might be casting a bit of a shadow on the ground again, similar to the tree. far as the ground plane is concerned, we can start probably working some lines that are a bit more horizontal out from the tree lines. We can start to get a bit darker as it recedes back to the trees and make this foreground section a bit lighter. As I say, it's not always the case in nature, but it does actually work, tends to work quite well when you're trying to make sense of a scene. It reads well for the viewer, I find. So just starting to give it a little bit of volume. You don't really need to draw individual, don't draw individual strands of grass. What you want to do is just create a kind of fuzziness at the edge in these sections where the water is overlapped by the grass, so it kind of softly wisps out into the grass, into the water. But you're not drawing individual tendrils. You're just trying to give a sense of softness because grass feels soft. But that's on those sections where the grass is overlapping the water. There's some sections where you can see the water cut back or you can see the bank cut back from the water, where you get kind of a muddier section probably. Say along here you see the back of that section of water. And there you want a kind of shadow that kind of reaches up, so there's form to the land basically. It's cutting back down into the water, and then because of perspective it's getting thinner, so the closer it is to us the deeper the bank is, but these more distant sections of bank are going to be darker than these sections that are closer to us. So you can see just by doing that, those little transitions suddenly makes the ground plane look a lot more complex. We can start to look for there are some little kind of more clumps of grass here, tufts that are growing up. Again, you're not drawing strands, you're just kind of giving a sense of kind of slightly overlapping soft forms. You want to think about where the light's coming from. Here there's a kind of a bank this section of bank kind of overlaps this one behind, which creates a sort of crease in the grass. Those are the sorts of things we're looking for. In this distant section, where it's kind of swampy, there's a kind of compression of those undulating forms. Then this edge is actually, we can pop in a little bit of a kind of scraggly bush or something like that, kind of overlapping slightly in the foreground. Maybe something kind of here as well, just to break up that foreground slightly. You can also put some little notches, kind of dark notches, maybe little tufts that have been taken out in the grass in the foreground. That'll start to make it seem like there's a little bit more detail going on nearer the viewer than further away, and that's obviously how we perceive things, so it makes things feel a bit more naturalistic. So you can keep adding detail like that, and we're pretty much done. As far as the level of finish I'd say you want to look for in a sketch, this is pretty good. So I've just darkened the extremes of the drawing, these two edges, left the middle a little bit lighter, and that kind of pulls your eye in. And the last thing I'm going to do is try to kind of create a sense that the center of the sky here is glowing, and that's being kind of reflected in the water. So working across the whole drawing, ever so lightly, I'm just going to get slightly lighter towards the center of the image. Do the same thing from this side. So you can see that background section now is slightly lighter, and I'm going to match it in the still water at the front. And there we have it. That's our finished drawing or sketch. So if you guys are able to make a sketch like that and send it through, if you sign up to OCAD, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, and you can also sign up to the class itself and get feedback from me as a tutor if you click through the links. But yeah, I'll look forward to seeing everyone's work. Hopefully it's all made sense as it's built up as a sort of process. It's useful for working from life and also from working from photographs. So yeah, that's it. Click subscribe, and you can keep up to date with new lessons. There'll be a new series starting soon, and I look forward to seeing you all there.